Mexico, From the Olmecs to the Aztecs, by Dr. Michael Coe and Rex Koontz. Chapter 3, The Archaic Period. 6,000 years of almost uninterruptedly high temperatures, as much as 2 degrees Celsius above present averages in some places, set in on the heels of the final advance of the ice around 7,000 BC. The pleasant term climatic optimum has been invented for this hypsothermal period in Western Europe, for where the inhabitants of the lands facing on the Atlantic enjoyed significantly wetter as well as warmer weather, perhaps the most balmy ever seen in those regions. Such favorable conditions hardly obtained elsewhere in the world, and in much of North America this long interval was largely one of desiccation. In contrast to the oak forests of humid Europe, vast areas of the New World were transformed into desert wastes. Although it may seem, during the hypsothermal period, people continued to live throughout even the most desiccated zones of North America. Species after species of large game perished not long after its onset, or even before it. While climate change has often been advanced as a cause of this ecological disaster, several scholars are convinced that this was a case of Pleistocene overkill by the American Indians themselves. Among the animals that disappeared at this time were the mastodon, the mammoth, the horse, not to reappear until the coming of the Spaniards, the camel, the giant bison, the ground sloth, and the dire wolf. But the Native Americans survived. New tools, especially food-grinding implements, new hunting methods, other sources of food, perhaps different forms of shelter, all these enabled people to adapt to radically altered conditions of life. The new stage of cultural adaptation obtained by the inhabitants of the New World is called the Archaic, and is the full equivalent of the Mesolithic stage in the western part of the Old World. Denied the rich hunting economy of their late Pleistocene predecessors, small bands of American Indians concentrated on more efficient methods of killing smaller game, on fishing and gathering of mollusks, and to an ever-increasing extent on the collection of specific plant foods. The desert culture in North America. In the dry semi-deserts of the Great Basin and southwestern United States, as well as north to Oregon and to south to Texas and Mexico, these archaic hunters and collectors inhabited caves and open sites near the ever-dwindling lakes or by seepages of water. The region that concerns us here, Mexico, must have been quite hot and dry, as shown by known shrinking of the Great Lake of the Valley of Mexico and by the overwhelming appearance of dry pollen indicators in the cores at this time. The pattern that enabled humans to eke out a livelihood in this inhospitable environment has been named the desert culture, which persisted into the 19th century among the nomadic Indians of the Great Basin. Its salient features include a sparse population with no groups larger than the band, caves and rock shelters favored for settlements, a subsistence pattern based on the seasonal exploitation of food resources such as rabbits, wild plant seeds, and even insects, preparation of plant foods by grinding them on a flat milling stone with a cobble mano, abundant basketry, matting, and sandals, known as early as 7000 BC in caves in Oregon. Spears tipped with relatively small percussion-chipped points and hurled by means of the atlat, a wide variety of scrapers, choppers, scraper planes, and so forth, of quite crude manufacture, and the dog, present for the first time in North America early in this development. The discovery of an archaic period of desert culture type in Mexico has unexpectedly thrown light on one of the great problems in New World archaeology. Where, when, and how were the major food plants domesticated by the American Indian? For it was the cultivation of maize, beans, and squash that made possible all the higher cultures of Mexico, and to a certain degree those of Peru as well. In the effort to bridge the gap between the ancient hunting peoples and the first indications of full-blown village life, the researches of Richard S. McNeish from the 1950s onward have produced particularly important results, and most later researchers build on his work while debating his conclusions. The most important results from McNeish's work are the central remaining questions surrounding the onset of village life, or described in this chapter. The origins of Mexican cultivated plants. There is no simple definition of the term domestication. Quite obviously, there is a difference between the domestication of an animal like the dog or the pig, which can and often do revert to the wild state, and a creature, the reproduction of which entirely depends upon the presence of human populations, such as the Egyptian chicken, which has lost the ability to incubate its own eggs. We are clearly dealing here with a broad spectrum, in which the degree of domestication may vary widely. One might thus adopt the definition proposed many years ago by the Russian geneticist Nikolai Vavilov, and say that it is evolution directed by the interference of humans. Basically, this implies that human beings have in some systematic way tampered with the reproduction of a certain species, a process that may be totally unwitting. As in animals, in its most extreme form, plant domestication ends up with species which cannot reproduce by themselves and which are therefore without wild populations. In the case of cereals and other plants that reproduce by means of seeds, this implies that artificial selection has resulted in species which lack the ability to disperse their seeds. Not until that state has been reached can botanists be sure of the presence of domestication in ancient plant remains. It is no accident that all the important food plants of the world belong in this category of totally captive populations, since the reduction of the ability to self-reproduce has resulted in greatly increased food values in the plants concerned. The importance of maize. The Aztecs believed that their hero god Quetzalcoatl, who created humanity with his own blood, turned himself into an ant so as to be able to steal a single grain of maize that the ants had hidden inside a mountain. This he gave to humans so that they might be nourished. Maize was and is the very basis of settled life in Mexico, and in fact, throughout the regions of the New World civilized in pre-Columbian times. Speculation as to the origin of this staple has therefore been freely indulged in, with many theories proposed which are no more firmly grounded than the Aztec myth recorded above. There are in fact two central problems still facing the student attempting to understand the domestication of corn. The identity of its ancestor or ancestors, in the data which fully domesticated maize, Z-maize, first appears, as an older generation of archaeologists was raised in the belief that the story of the domestication of maize was completely known. Since maize, Z-maize, is a grass with no known wild forms, the search was early started for a closely related species in the wild state. In the highlands of Chiapas and Guatemala, near the very heart of the so-called Old Empire of the Maya, a grass called Teosinte, Zea mexicana, grows in and near Indian cornfields as an unwanted weed. This species is the closest relative of maize. It was very early claimed that this was the wild ancestor of maize, and that the process of taming it to meet human needs was the achievement of the notably advanced Maya. From these people, maize was supposed to have spread, along with the arts of civilization, far and wide throughout the world. Although this theory has been subjected to a number of criticisms, there still exist among arguments for Teosinte as the ancestor of maize, but there is no evidence that the Maya were the overseers of domestication. In a slightly more complex scenario, the late Paul C. Mangelsdorf and his colleagues finished 40 years of research by suggesting that perennial Teosinte must have crossed with an extinct wild ancestor of maize to produce annual Teosinte, which then led to maize. The eminent geneticist George Beadle, however, had long ago proclaimed that any theory based on an extinct or unknown ancestor was not satisfactory. Beadle countered Mangelsdorf's scenario with the contention that the simplest explanation was also the best, that maize arose solely from the process of human selection of Teosinte plants, and thus Teosinte is the only ancestor of maize. Recent studies of molecular biology of maize and its putative ancestors also point to Teosinte as the sole progenitor of maize. Through the isolation of genes that control the traits separating maize and Teosinte in a crossbred population, for example, John Dabley has proposed specific steps in the transformation of ancestor to domesticate. Other similar studies propose to trace the origin of maize to a particular strain of Teosinte found in the Balsas River drainage of western Mexico. These studies have been criticized, however, for their tacit acceptance of Teosinte as the sole progenitor. Another relative of maize is Tripsacum, a wild grass distributed throughout North and South America. Although not as closely related as Teosinte, it has long played a role in certain explanations of maize development, largely because of properties produced when crossed with Teosinte or maize itself. By crossing Tripsacum with Teosinte, Mary Eubanks has recently been able to produce some plants that resemble the oldest archaeological maize remains, as well as others that resemble reconstructed wild maize, suggesting to that researcher that perhaps Tripsacum did play a role in the earliest domestication of maize. While the researchers above focus mainly on the semi-arid highlands of Mexico as the hearth of domestication, a scenario defined largely by the work of Richard S. McNeish, several researchers are now investigating the role of the tropical lowlands in these developments. Unlike the dry caves of the highlands, rarely if ever are large plant remains preserved in this hot, humid environment, so other sources of information must be consulted. Phytoliths, fossil evidence of plant cells, related to maize have been found as early as 7000 BC in Panama and Ecuador, far to the south of the generally accepted hearth of maize domestication. Pollen related to maize also appears just after 5000 BC in Panama. It is very difficult, however, to distinguish closely related plants using such molecular methods, so that it may be unclear whether these phytoliths and pollen are maize, teosinte, or even Tripsacum. This identification problem does not disprove any role for the lowlands, but does make it difficult to argue unequivocally for maize domestication in the area at those early dates. This situation hampers scenarios that depend heavily on molecular data, such as the Balsas River drainage hypothesis described above. When molecular data is combined with other evidence of human occupation and domestication, however, it makes a much stronger case. Recently, archaeologists Mary Pohl and Kevin Pope have found large maize phytoliths, probable domesticates, dated to 4800 BC on the Gulf Coast of Tabasco, very near the later Olmec site of La Venta. There are no known wild species of Z native to coastal Tabasco, so these plants were introduced to the region almost certainly by humans. At the same level, the archaeologists found evidence of large-scale forest clearance of the type associated with maize cultivation in this area. If this Tabasco material is true maize cultivation, then it would be the earliest record of such activity that we have. In the highlands, the earliest firmly dated maize cob, was found in Guilanaquit's cave in Oaxaca and dated to 4300 BC. Cobs from caves in Tehuacan, Puebla, found by McNeish and long thought to date to circa 5000 BC through radiocarbon dating of associated materials, have recently been subjected to direct dating of the cobs themselves and found to date to 3500 BC and after. This Tehuacan sequence is crucial for the domestication of maize in particular and the Archaic Period in general, for it is mainly through the work of McNeish and his colleagues that we obtain our first systematic picture of this period. See the Tehuacan Valley below. Any major revision in the sequence would cause a certain amount of readjustment in our vision of the entire Archaic Period. McNeish was vehement in his defense of the earlier dates for these cobs, citing contamination in these samples as the cause of the discrepancy. Whatever the final outcome of the Tehuacan date debate, it is clear from the cob shape of both the Tehuacan and Oaxaca examples that considerable evolution of maize had already occurred, throwing open the question once again of when and where domestication first happened. We have some way to go before we answer these questions, but the most important general fact remains. Many thousands of years before Christ, the Indians of Mesoamerica had brought a very primitive, wild form of maize under their control. This was indeed the most crucial step along the road leading to great pre-Columbian civilizations. Other cultigens. Although maize was certainly the most important plant for ancient Mexicans, it was not the first to be domesticated. Recently, Bruce D. Smith has found evidence of domesticated squash as early as 8000 BC, which would make it easily the earliest reliably dated Mesoamerican domesticate. The seeds and other plant remains used to date the domestication were found in Guilanaquit's cave in Oaxaca, and it has been suggested that the type of squash found there is a distant relative of today's pumpkin. Around the same time, archaic foragers were probably domesticating the bottle gourd, which is a relative of the early squash. While the squash seeds provided a source of protein that was easy to store and transport, the bottle gourd provided a portable container for drinking water, so important to these early nomadic peoples. While maize is at the center of the Mesoamerican food complex, other vegetable foods, especially chili peppers, always accompany it. The pre-Spanish Mexicans consumed an extraordinary array of plant foods, from various kinds of beans to squashes to chili peppers to fruits. In fact, it is difficult to imagine what the world's cuisines were like before the discovery of Mexico and Peru. The list in the accompanying table is incomplete and does not, of course, give all the varieties or races of each plant. The common bean, known in many varieties today, is the most popular in Mexican diets and presumably has been so since very early periods. Its nutritional importance stems from the fact that its proteins complement those of maize. On the basis of a distribution of wild forms, Nikolai Vavilov suggested a primary domestication in Mexico or Guatemala. Of these squashes, there are three major species in Mexico: pumpkin, warty or crookneck squash, and walnut squash. The forms of all of which are virtually legion, as any visitor to a Mexican food market can readily testify. The origins of all of these from wild ancestors or through hybridization are very little understood, although a very early domesticant has been identified, and the sequence of their appearance in Mexico is now established. The same might be said of chili peppers, today the major ingredient in hot foods the world over, but of Mexican and Peruvian origin. The major problem with this particular seasoning, also an important source of vitamins to Indian populations, is the difficulty of distinguishing between wild and domesticated seeds. Archaeological evidence for the origins of many other cultigens is rare to non-existent, in part due to the perishable nature of root crops. Thus, the antiquity and role of the manioc in the tropical lowlands of Mesoamerica are not known, in spite of the fact that this is an important food plant there today. Also important are the decorative plants of Mexico, such as the dahlia, marigold, and zinnia. The marigold, for instance, has a significant part to play in the long roster of Mexican medicinal plants. Omitted from the table are economically important trees which are protected rather than actually domesticated, such as the bredna tree, the sacred ceiba, symbolic of the tree of life, mahogany, and the sapodilla tree, which produce valuable fruit, wood, and chicle latex for chewing gum. Caves and rock shelters of northeastern Mexico. Richard S. McNeish's search for the origins of agriculture and settled life in Mexico first led him to the almost rainless semi-desert environment of Tamaulipas, the northeasternmost Mexican state. It is actually beyond the frontier of Mesoamerica. The tribes encountered by the Spaniards in this backward region were, with few exceptions, hunters and collectors without knowledge of cultivation. McNeish was drawn to this region because the aridity of Tamaulipas has meant ideal conditions of preservation in cave and rock shelter sites, of which a good many were discovered. In the course of his excavations, he uncovered the first evidence for an entirely new stage in the prehistory of Mexico, the Archaic or incipient agricultural period, lasting from about 7000 BC to after 2000 BC. The archaic Tamaulipas tool inventory is fairly typical of the desert culture throughout western and southern North America. In chipped stone, there were scrapers, choppers, pebble hammerstones, and disc scrapers, most of which were probably used in the preparation of vegetable foods. Projectile points, used in the hunting of deer, were fixed with rosin to shafts of darts, short spears hurled with the atlat. Plant products were also processed with ground stone tools such as mortars, pestles, manos, and crude milling stones. McNeish concludes that the economy largely rested upon hunting, collecting, and the grinding of wild seeds. As part of this complex, there were simple nets and turned and coiled baskets, while cordage was made from the fiber of wild plants like yucca and agave. People slept on twilled mats. These, known as petates, are still standard sleeping gear for millions of Indians in backcountry Mexico. Plant materials and dried feces, or coprolites, were remarkably well preserved and abundant, for the ancient inhabitants of these rock shelters had only scanty notions of hygiene. The diet was heavy in vegetable foods, some of which came from domesticated plants. Earliest of all is the bottle gourd. This appeared by about 6500 BC. It is even older in the Archaic period of Oaxaca, and thus would squash the most ancient cultigen of the New World. The history of the bottle gourd, usable only as a container since the meat is inedible, is puzzling. It is believed by botanists to be of Old World origin, probably with an initial center of domestication in Africa. Tests have shown that the seeds are viable after the dried gourd has been immersed for several years in seawater. Accordingly, the likelihood is that the plant floated from Africa to the New World to land on some eastern shore. How, then, did the American Indians adopt it as their own? It is remotely possible that some beachcomber of a distant era came across the gourd by accident, carried it back to the camp, and sowed the seeds. One hardly needs to stress that this reconstruction is pure fantasy, but we are not prepared to adopt the alternative explanation, namely that African voyagers carried the gourd with them on a sea trip to the west at this early date. Other plants occur in the Tamaulipas sequence at somewhat later dates, including pumpkin, scarlet runner beans, chili peppers, common beans, and squashes in that order. There was no wild maize in McNeish's excavations, but the cobs of a tiny eared popcorn with many podcorn characteristics appear between 3000 and 2200 BC. This suggested to McNeish that he should be looking further south for the origins of maize. Santa Marta Rock Shelter. As one travels from the Grijalva Basin, the Chiapas highlands grow increasingly arid. Santa Marta Rock Shelter lies in this dry zone near the town of Ocozocuautla on the Pan American Highway and was tested by McNeish and Frederick Peterson in 1959. 5 successive archaic occupations in the cave were directly overlain by pottery-bearing deposits ascribable to the early preclassic horizon. Radiocarbon dates for the archaic levels indicate a span from at least 6700 BC to an extremely dry period after 5000 BC. The complex of tool and point types duplicates that of Tamaulipas and includes dart points, gouges, scraper planes, pebble manos, and boulder querns, etc. 4 burials were found together, 3 of them flexed in fetal posture and 1 extended above, all the dead having been covered as a group with metates. Or metates, I'm not sure. Burials of this sort occur in desert culture contexts as far north as Wyoming. Maize pollen makes its appearance only in the early preclassic occupation, both pollens and other maize plants parts being completely absent from the pre-pottery levels. So, we might draw the conclusion that in the search for maize origins, Chiapas, on the southeastern periphery of Mexico, is perhaps too far south, just as Tamaulipas appears to be too much to the north. The Tehuacan Valley. One of the most exciting discoveries in Mexican archaeology in recent decades has been the actual remains of wild maize found in archaeological deposits in highland Mexico. In 1960, McNeish turned his attention to the Tehuacan Valley in southeastern Puebla, some 130 miles southeast of Mexico City. Lying in the rain shadow of the Sierra Madre Range that protects it to the east, the valley is an arid cactus and thorn scrub-covered desert not unlike southern Arizona. So dry is it that effective agriculture capable of supporting a large population is only possible with irrigation, a technique that goes back here to the first millennium BC. McNeish's preliminary reconnaissance of the bone-dry caves and rock shelters which bordered the valley led to a 4-season project which uncovered, at long last, cobs of wild maize as well as of the earliest cultivated variety. It will be remembered that the Ahueredo phase, an early hunter's occupation of the valley, ended about 7000 BC. During the succeeding El Riego phase, 7000 to 5000 BC, 2 significant changes had come about. The first is that the climate turned warmer, perhaps resulting with human help in the disappearance of big game. The second is that by the end of the phase, the Tehuacan people had begun interfering with the evolution of certain plants. Surely domesticated were the avocado, chili peppers, amaranth, and walnut squash. As Tamaulipas, the preponderance of vegetable food, both wild and domesticated, in the diet is reflected by numerous mortars and pestles, and by milling stones and pebble manos. Large plano-convex scrapers and choppers were probably used for pulping various plant materials. Chip projectile points for atla-propelled darts are present, used in hunting deer and other relatively small game. There are some surprising features in El Riego. 2 bowls of domestic cotton were recovered, apparently the world's first. Some quite elaborate burials from the phase were found in caves, the bodies being wrapped in blankets and nets, and the head sometimes removed, ceremonially smashed, and deposited in baskets in a burial group of 2 children. The head of the older was found in a basket resting on the chest of the younger. Possibly we are confronted here with a very early case of human sacrifice. While population size had increased, the El Riego people remained seasonally nomadic. During the dry season, camps were occupied by microbands which lived mainly by hunting. In the spring, these moved onto the slopes of the valley, collecting seeds, and in the summer wet season they were able to pick fruit. Perhaps when there was more rain than usual, they were able to coalesce into macrobands. In the fall, with a diminution of food supplies, they moved back to their winter abodes. One of the great transition points in New World prehistory is to be seen in the Koshkatlan phase, 5000 to 3400 BC. The economy and settlement pattern in the valley remained much the same, but to the list of domesticates were added to the bottle gourd, common bean, black sapote, and warty squash. The evidence is now quite clear that these and other plants were domesticated in different places and at different times. Most important is the appearance of maize for the first time anywhere in the New World, although dates early in this period are now under re-evaluation. Maize here proved to be of 2 types, a wild variety and an early domesticated one which was probably planted, like already existing cultigens, when microbands came together in the spring. The minuscule cobs of wild maize so closely approached the reconstructed ancestor of maize that Mangelsdorf was confident that the ancestor of corn had been found. In particular, they exhibited the extended glumes, the tiny kernel size, and the bearing of the male tassel on the female ear of the hypothetical progenitor, as well as showing no variation among themselves, a wild characteristic. But as proponents of the Teosinte theory of maize origins have pointed out, they also looked distressingly like Teosinte. For further, as we have seen, a botanist has been able to reproduce plants similar to the Tehuacan examples by crossing Tripsacum and a certain strain of Teosinte. The controversy, nevertheless, may be of more interest to plant geneticists than to the students of ancient Mexican culture, for the important point is to remember is that the world's most productive domesticated plant had now come under human control. The process of domestication, in Macneice's present way of thinking, took place somewhere in the Puebla, Oaxaca region during the 7000 to 5000 BC time period. While current research agrees with this time frame, it is not certain that the area of domestication was the Puebla, Oaxaca region. The succeeding Abejas phase, 3400 to 2300 BC, saw a distinct change in the Tehuacan settlement pattern, with small hamlets of 5 to 10 pit houses down on the valley floor. Domestic plants newly added to the cuisine were tepary beans, perhaps the pumpkin, and hybrid maize showing introgression with Teosinte. While a study of the late Eric Callan of Abejas coprolites reveals that 70% of the diet was still based on wild plants and animals, the increasing cultivation of crops for storage in specially made caches and pits was associated with longer and longer stays in band encampments. The result was the possibility of staying in one place all year. Sedentism was gradually replacing nomadism. It will be seen in the next chapter that early preclassic pottery centers on the necklace jar or tecomate and the flat-bottom bowl with outslanting sides. It is probably significant that in Abejas these same shapes are seen in beautifully made groundstone vessels, perhaps prototypes for later ceramics. In fact, during the final archaic phase in the valley, the poorly known Peron, 2300-1500 BC, crude, gravel-tempered pottery makes its appearance, late in the sequence, but certainly by 1650 BC. The so-called pox pottery, found by Charles and Ellen Brush in the Middens on the coast of Guerrero, is close in appearance to the Peron ceramics and has similarly early radiocarbon dates. In the hot, fertile Soconuscos coast of southeastern Chiapas, on the border between Mexico and the Maya area, the people of the Barra culture were already crafting highly sophisticated ceramics that are at least in part contemporary with Peron, and may be the source from which most of the pottery traditions of the Mesoamerican preclassic stem. Nonetheless, it is quite unlikely that pottery, that index fossil of fully sedentary life, was independently developed in Mesoamerica, for agricultural villages with well-developed ceramics have a far greater antiquity along the Caribbean and Pacific coasts of northern South America, and many archaeologists believe that the idea of hiring clay to make vessels spread from there to Mexico. Other archaic sites. In the valley of Oaxaca, Kent Flannery and his associates have uncovered a long pre-ceramic sequence paralleling that of Tehuacan in some respects, but adding new and sometimes contradictory data. Most of Flannery's sites are caves, such as Gila Nakit cited above, but the open-air site of Geoshi was particularly interesting as it showed evidence of activity features, such as a possible dance floor or ball court area, some 65 feet long and 23 feet wide, bordered with stones. As for food plants, there are pollen grains of the genus Zea in 7400 to 6700 BC levels, which apparently represent wild maize. Rinds of bottle gourds and seeds and peduncles of pumpkins are also this early, and so predate their appearance in Tehuacan. The role of the lowlands, plagued by poor archaeological preservation, is relatively unknown, although current research is certainly enlarging the role it will play in future accounts of the Archaic. It is probable that maize is a seed crop of highland origin, but lowland root crops like manioc leave little if any archaeological evidence. A single manioc pollen grain was found in Tabasco, associated with maize cultivation, and dated to 4600 BC. But pollen evidence cannot identify species, leaving the question of domestication open. Thus, while there are good data on hunting, gathering, and fishing for an extensive archaic village found by Jeffrey Wilkerson as Santa Luisa on the north coast of Veracruz, the absence of manos and metates need not necessarily mean an absence of cultivation, since manioc preparation does not require these. Similarly, pre-pottery levels in shell middens at Puerto Marquez and Ilona de Chantuto on the Pacific coast may be manifestations of an otherwise unknown incipient agricultural way of life. One of the most important archaic discoveries has been at Tlapacoya, once an isolated island in the southern part of the Valley of Mexico. Circular houses like those of the abejas plant phase have been uncovered, along with an extremely crude female figurine of pottery, dated 2300 BC, the oldest discovered in Mesoamerica, and apparently the beginning of a tradition that was to flourish in the Preclassic. The Archaic Period and the Origins of Settled Life. The idea that the invention and adoption of food production led to a revolution in the advancement of mankind was elaborated by V. Gordon Cheadle and has influenced the way of thinking of almost all who deal with this point in human history. At the time that Cheadle wrote, 1925 through 1956, almost nothing was known in the transition between hunting and gathering and the food-producing way of life, either in the Old World or in the New. The mere absence of the evidence made the jump seem almost more sudden than subsequent work has shown it actually to have been. Now, for Peru and Mexico, we have evidence of a very slow progress toward fully settled life. The alleged revolution was seemingly more in the nature of a leisurely evolution. Yet it cannot be denied that the consequences of food production were in the long run of the greatest importance. Davy has demonstrated that the density of population of peoples on the Neolithic or Preclassic level of food getting is 25 times greater than the figure for primitive hunters and gatherers. The domestication of plants and animals obviously resulted in a quantum increase in the world's population, no matter how long the process took. In Mexico, and probably in Mesoamerica in general, the development of plant cultivation took place during the Archaic period in a context which is almost indistinguishable from that of the desert culture, known so well in the Great Basin country of the American West. Back in this remote time, the ancestors of the mighty Aztecs and other civilized people of Mexico probably closely resembled the simple but resourceful Digger Indians of Nevada and California, so despised by Mark Twain and other Western travelers of the Victorian area. Semi-nomadic bands were forced into a seasonal cycle of hunting and collecting by the poverty of the relatively rainless Mexican environment. As the Hypsothermal wore on, however, their efficiency at collecting plant foods began to outweigh their hunting prowess, with an increasing amount of settling down. Seasonal camps took on the appearance of tiny villages. As a result of systematic exploitation of certain kinds of plants, especially of wild grasses like maize, vegetable foods and their energy were tamed and captured. According to present evidence, the process began with the bottle gourd, which may have been an accidental introduction, and squash, followed by beans and chili peppers. Maize was most likely domesticated before 5000 BC, although at that time it hardly resembled the giant hybrid of plants of modern Iowa cornfields. Other domesticated food plants are much later, and a few, like the peanut, were probably disseminated to Mexico from South America in post-archaic times. By the time of the first village farming cultures, at the onset of pre-classic, there were already present many of the features of settled life. All the important domesticates, the milling stones and manos on which maize was prepared, baskets, nets, cordage, mats, and apparently even wattle and daub houses. With the elaboration of pottery, almost certainly introduced from the lowland regions of South America, and with the yet mysterious improvement of maize at this great transition, the stage is set for a way of life that has remained unaltered to this day in the peaceful backwaters of Mexico. This concludes Chapter 3.